It all started about a year ago, and honestly, I still can't wrap my head around how things got so messed up so fast. I never imagined I'd end up here, pouring my soul out to strangers on the internet, but I need to get this out of my system because the weight of it all is exhausting. So, here's the story. Buckle up because it's a wild one. My best friend is Matt. We've known each other since middle school, and his younger sister, Emily, was always around in the background. Emily was different. I'm not trying to sound mean, but she had her share of struggles, mental health issues that everyone kind of knew about but didn't really discuss openly. Matt didn't bring it up much, and honestly, it wasn't my business. We were all just living our lives, and Emily was just Matt's little sister to me. Fast forward to last summer. Out of nowhere, Emily messages me on Instagram. It was already weird because we'd never really talked one-on-one before. The message was short, "Hey, I need to talk to you. It's serious." My stomach immediately sank because nothing good ever starts with, "It's serious." I asked her what was up, and after a painfully long pause, she dropped the bomb. "I'm pregnant. And it's yours." I stared at my phone like it was about to catch fire. My first reaction was to laugh because it was so absurd. I'd never even been alone with Emily, let alone slept with her. Hell, I'd never even hugged her. It was like someone accusing you of robbing a bank you've never set foot in. I responded, trying to keep calm, "Emily, I don't know what you're talking about. That's not possible. We've never, you know." She doubled down. "You don't remember? You were drunk. It happened." I wasn't drunk. I wasn't anywhere near her. And I knew for a fact this was pure fiction. But the way she said it, with so much conviction, planted this tiny, nagging seed of doubt in my brain. I started replaying random nights in my head, trying to find some gap, some blackout moment, but there was nothing. I was completely certain. This never happened. I told her she was wrong, but she kept insisting. It felt like trying to argue with a wall. Every message from her was more emotional than the last. "You're abandoning me. You're abandoning your child. How can you live with yourself?" I stopped responding after that. For a brief moment, I thought that was the end of it. Maybe she'd realized she was mistaken, or just let it go. But nope. A week later, my parents called me, and the second I picked up, I knew they already knew. My mom's voice was sharp and cold. "We raised you better than this, Adam." I was completely blindsided. My parents are traditional, small-town people. Family values, honor, all that. The kind of people who think a child out of wedlock is the end of the world. I tried to explain. I said, "Mom, Dad, I swear on everything I've never been with Emily. Not once." She's lying. But it was like talking to two brick walls. They kept repeating the same things over and over. "Own up to your responsibility. Be a man. Step up and do the right thing." At one point, my dad said, "You've disgraced this family." I couldn't believe it. My own parents were looking at me like I was a villain, like they didn't even know me. I brought up the idea of a paternity test, hoping that would shut this whole thing down, but when I mentioned it to Emily, she flat out refused. She said something about how tests can be faked, and you just need to accept this. That set off alarm bells in my head. If she was so sure I was the father, why not just take the test and prove it? Why was she running from the one thing that could end all doubt? I told her straight up, "If you're not taking a test, I'm not signing anything. I'm not getting involved in this mess unless there's proof." That did not go over well. Emily went back to my parents and spun some sob story about how I was refusing to support her, how I was leaving her high and dry in her time of need. And my parents ate it up. They didn't care about logic or reason. They cared about the image of their son being some kind of deadbeat dad. Things escalated from there. Every phone call turned into a screaming match. My mom cried, my dad yelled, and I just sat there in disbelief. I even showed them proof, plane tickets and hotel receipts showing that I was out of state during the supposed conception. But they brushed it off like it didn't matter. People make mistakes, Adam. Stop running from your responsibilities. It felt like I was losing my mind. I started questioning everything. How could they believe this? How could they look at me, their son, and think I was capable of something like this? Eventually, the argument stopped because we just stopped talking altogether. My parents told me they couldn't support me if I was going to abandon my child. They said if I didn't step up, they'd disown me. At first, I thought it was an empty threat. It wasn't. They stopped calling, stopped texting. I'd been effectively cut off. No invites to family dinners, no holiday plans. Just silence. I tried to move on. My friends mostly had my back, though even a couple of them gave me that skeptical look, like, "Are you sure, man? Maybe you just don't remember?" It was isolating. Everywhere I turned, there was doubt, judgment, and this overwhelming feeling of betrayal. My own parents believed some wild story over me. 6 months later, Emily gave birth. I didn't even know until a mutual friend told me. My mom was apparently at the hospital, holding the baby like it was her grandchild. I had no choice. I had to take legal action. I filed to force a paternity test through the courts. It was a long, drawn-out process, but eventually, the results came back. 0% chance I was the father. I thought that would fix everything. I thought my parents would see the truth, apologize, and we'd all move forward. I couldn't have been more wrong. When the paternity test results came back and confirmed what I'd been saying all along, that there was a literal 0% chance I was the father, I felt this brief wave of relief. Like I could finally breathe after months of suffocating under the weight of everyone else's assumptions. But the relief didn't last long because, as it turned out, people don't like admitting they were wrong. Especially not my parents. I sent them a copy of the results immediately, expecting, I don't know, maybe an apology? A phone call where they'd tell me they were sorry for not believing me, for throwing me out of their lives over a blatant lie. Instead, my phone started blowing up with emotional text from my mom, half apologies mixed with excuses. Stuff like, "We just didn't know what to believe, and you have to understand, we were only trying to do what's right." My dad, on the other hand, sent me one short message, "We'll talk when you're ready to be reasonable." Reasonable? Are you kidding me? I wasn't the one who believed a completely baseless accusation. I wasn't the one who disowned their own child without even hearing him out. But apparently, in my dad's mind, I was still the one being unreasonable. And then, of course, there was Emily. When she found out about the results, she completely spiraled. First, she went around telling anyone who'd listened that I'd somehow faked or tampered with the test results. Yeah, because apparently, I'm some criminal mastermind who can manipulate DNA tests in a certified lab. Then she switched tactics and started posting these long, tear-filled Facebook rants about how some men can just walk away from their responsibilities without caring about the consequences. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. The damage was already done. People had chosen their sides months ago, and even with hard scientific evidence on my side, some people still gave me those judgmental looks whenever I'd see them around town. A few even came up to me in person, people I barely knew, saying stuff like, "You should have just done the right thing from the start, man." What was the right thing, exactly? Taking responsibility for a child that wasn't mine? Signing my life away because someone decided to point a finger at me? At this point, I started avoiding places where I might run into people who knew Emily or my family. Grocery stores, coffee shops. I'd even take different routes home just to avoid crossing paths with someone who might stop me and ask, "So, how's the baby?" Meanwhile, my parents were still trying to smooth things over, but in their own twisted way. My mom started leaving these long, emotional voicemails. She'd ramble about how much she missed me, how she just wanted our family to be whole again, and how we should all just sit down and talk things out. But she never actually said the words, "I'm sorry." Not once. My dad, predictably, took a different approach. He sent me an email offering to buy me a car. Like that was going to somehow erase everything they'd done. I didn't respond to either of them. Not because I didn't care, but because I was just exhausted. I was so drained from months of arguing, defending myself, being made to feel like I was losing my mind. I couldn't keep rehashing the same conversation with people who refused to admit they'd been wrong. And Emily wasn't done, either. She started contacting my friends. Some of them messaged me, confused, asking if what she was saying was true. She told them that I'd abandoned her, that I'd used her, and that I was spreading lies about her. She even reached out to one of my exes, Rebecca, who I hadn't spoken to in years. Rebecca texted me out of the blue, saying, "Hey, I don't know what's going on, but Emily reached out to me and said some pretty messed up stuff about you. Are you okay?" That was the final straw for me. I called Emily directly. I didn't yell. I didn't lose my temper, but I was firm. I told her to stop involving other people in her mess, to stop dragging my name through the mud, and to stop contacting anyone I knew. Her response? She laughed. Actually laughed, like this was all some kind of joke to her. Then she hung up on me. At that point, I realized this wasn't going to stop unless I made it stop. I talked to a lawyer again and started looking into getting a restraining order. I didn't want to escalate things to that level, but I was out of options. Emily wasn't going to stop until she burned every bridge in my life. My parents must have found out about the restraining order because suddenly, the tone of their messages changed. My mom sent this long, rambling text about how families should never take each other to court, how I was breaking her heart, how I was better than this. My dad's message was short, as always. Think carefully before you do something you can't take back. But the thing is, they'd already done something they couldn't take back. They'd chosen to believe Emily over me. They'd chosen to cut me out of their lives when I told them the truth. They let this spiral out of control until it reached the point where lawyers and court orders were my only options. The restraining order went through eventually, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my life again. Emily was legally required to stay away from me, and my parents were barred from contacting me directly. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was something. But even then, the damage had been done. My relationship with my parents felt irreparable. My reputation in town was still stained by months of rumors, and Emily, well, Emily still had her army of sympathizers who refused to believe the truth even when it was staring them in the face. I started distancing myself from anyone connected to the situation. Friends who'd been on the fence, family members who kept saying, "But they're still your parents," even mutual acquaintances who'd stayed silent through it all. I couldn't deal with it anymore. I focused on rebuilding my life, one day at a time. Some days were better than others. Some days, I'd feel strong and confident in my decisions. Other days, I'd feel this crushing wave of guilt and doubt, like maybe I could have done something differently to stop all of this from happening. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't my fault. I didn't start this mess, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let it keep me down. After the restraining order was finalized, I expected things to calm down. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally exhale without the constant anxiety of waiting for the next bomb to drop. Emily couldn't contact me anymore, and my parents were legally barred from showing up at my place or trying to interfere in my life. But if I thought that was going to stop them from finding new ways to make my life miserable, I was dead wrong. It started small. A few mutual acquaintances stopped talking to me altogether. People who used to be friendly now gave me side eyes or crossed the street when they saw me coming. At first, I chalked it up to the fallout from the whole Emily situation. It's a small town, and gossip spreads like wildfire. But then I started hearing whispers. People were saying that I had gone too far by taking legal action against my own family. Apparently, my parents had been making the rounds, playing the victim card to anyone who would listen. My mom was telling people that she was heartbroken and that I'd cut them off without explanation. My dad, on the other hand, kept it simple. He turned his back on his family. They never mentioned the months of harassment, the restraining order, or the fact that they disowned me long before I ever stepped into a courtroom. They made it sound like I was some ungrateful son who had decided, out of nowhere, to wage war against his own family. At first, I tried to ignore it. I stayed off social media, avoided public places where I knew I'd run into people who were friendly with my parents, and kept my head down. But then they started reaching out to people in my life directly. One day, I got a text from an old high school friend named Chris. We hadn't talked in years, so seeing his name pop up on my phone felt random. His message was short. "Hey man, your folks are really worried about you. You good? Worried about me?" That's how they were framing this. I called Chris immediately and asked him what was going on. Turns out, my parents had reached out to him, someone I hadn't spoken to in ages, and told him that I was struggling and had pushed them away for no reason. They framed themselves as two grieving parents who just wanted to reconnect with their troubled son. Chris bought it, at least partially, until I laid out everything that had actually happened. But Chris wasn't the only one they contacted. Over the next couple of weeks, I started getting messages from other people, distant cousins, former coworkers, even my old college roommate. They all said variations of the same thing. Your parents are worried about you. You should talk to them. Some of them sounded genuinely concerned, while others were clearly just trying to fish for gossip. It felt like I was being hunted. No matter how many people I blocked or how many conversations I shut down, more kept popping up. It wasn't just frustrating. It was humiliating. My parents weren't just trying to reconcile with me. They were trying to control the narrative, to make me look like the villain. The final straw came when they contacted my boss. Yeah, my actual boss at work. I was pulled into his office one afternoon, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. He asked me if everything was okay at home, if there was anything I needed to talk about. My stomach dropped. My parents had called my workplace and told my boss they were concerned for my well-being. I couldn't believe it. My professional life, one of the only stable things I had left, was now being dragged into their mess. I had to sit there, red-faced and humiliated, while I explained the entire situation to my boss. Thankfully, he was understanding and reassured me that I had nothing to worry about at work, but the damage was already done. I felt exposed, like there was no corner of my life they wouldn't try to invade. After that, I knew I couldn't keep letting them run wild like this. I called my lawyer again and asked if there was anything else we could do to shut this down. She suggested sending a cease and desist letter to make it crystal clear that their behavior had to stop. So we did. The letter was sent out, and for a little while, things went quiet. But quiet doesn't always mean peaceful. It felt more like the eye of a storm. Still, but full of tension. I started parking my car a few blocks away from my apartment, just in case. I installed security cameras outside my door and changed the locks. Maybe it was paranoia, but after everything that had happened, I couldn't take any chances. Then, one night, I walked out to my car and saw it. The word liar had been keyed into the driver's side door. My stomach flipped, and my hands started shaking. I had no proof it was my parents or Emily, but deep down, I knew. Who else would go this far? Who else had this level of obsession? I filed a police report, but nothing came of it. Vandalism is low on the priority list, and without cameras catching someone in the act, there wasn't much they could do. But it was another reminder that this wasn't over. A few weeks later, my mom sent me a handwritten letter. I don't know why I opened it. I should have just thrown it away. But curiosity got the better of me. The letter was 4 pages long, front and back, filled with emotional pleas and guilt trips. She said things like, "Family is supposed to stick together no matter what," and "You've broken your father's heart." There was even a line about how my grandparents would be so disappointed in me. It was classic manipulation. Not once did she acknowledge the harassment, the lies, or the months of torment they'd put me through. Not once did she say the words, "I'm sorry." I folded the letter back up and put it in a drawer. I didn't respond. I couldn't. There was nothing left to say. In the weeks that followed, I started to feel numb. The anger, the sadness, the confusion. It all started blending together into this dull ache in the background of my life. I went through the motions: work, eat, sleep, repeat. Every now and then, I'd get a pang of guilt, wondering if maybe, just maybe, I'd overreacted. But then I'd remember the restraining order, the keyed car, the phone calls to my boss, and I'd snap out of it. There's a point where you realize that some people are never going to change. They're never going to see themselves as the problem. And no matter how much you wish things were different, you can't force someone to take responsibility for their actions. I started focusing on rebuilding my life. I cut off anyone who was still tied to my parents or Emily. I surrounded myself with the friends who had stood by me, the ones who didn't need proof to believe me. It wasn't easy, and it still isn't. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I started to feel like I had a little bit of peace. But peace doesn't always last. And of course, this story wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. A few months passed after the car incident, and for a while, things were quiet. Not peaceful, not entirely calm, but quiet enough that I could almost pretend life was normal again. I kept my head down, went to work, focused on rebuilding some sense of routine. Therapy helped. My close friends stuck by me. And slowly, I started feeling like I was getting my feet back under me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not really. People like my parents and Emily don't just let things go. They stew, they plot, and eventually they strike again. The next blow came in the form of a letter. Not a handwritten guilt trip from my mom this time, but a formal legal letter delivered to my mailbox. At first, I thought it was something related to the restraining order, maybe some follow-up paperwork. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. My parents were suing me. I had to read the letter 3 times before it fully sank in. They were suing me for emotional distress. Yeah, you read that right. Emotional distress. According to their claims, my decision to cut them off, pursue legal action, and enforce boundaries had caused them severe emotional suffering and had irreparably damaged their standing within the community. They even claimed I'd alienated them from the family. I sat on my couch, letter in hand, feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. I knew they'd gone far before, but this was a whole new level of insane. Suing your own child because he refused to roll over and let you walk all over him? I called my lawyer immediately, practically shoving the letter in her face the next day. She flipped through it, eyebrows raised in that "are you kidding me?" kind of way. When she finished, she sighed and said, "We'll fight this. It's absurd, and they don't have a leg to stand on. But it's going to be a long process." And she was right. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, documentation, and endless recounting of everything that had happened. Every text message, every voicemail, every screenshot of Emily's posts. I had to relive it all over again. It felt like peeling open a wound that had barely started to scab over. But while the lawsuit dragged on, my parents kept up their public campaign against me. They were reaching out to more distant relatives now, people I hadn't spoken to in years, people I barely even knew. My Aunt Susan, someone I hadn't seen since I was 12, sent me a message out of the blue. "Adam, family is family. You need to make things right before it's too late." It was exhausting. I couldn't go a week without some random person popping up in my inbox, parroting the same lines my parents had been feeding them. They'd spun this whole narrative where I was the cruel, ungrateful son who had cut off his loving family for no reason. It didn't matter that I had court documents, test results, and literal restraining orders to prove otherwise. People believe what they want to believe, and my parents had always been good at playing the victim. And then, of course, Emily made her grand return. One afternoon, I got a text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me open it. It was Emily. "I hope you're happy. You've destroyed this family. You'll regret this one day." That was it. Just one chilling, bitter message. I blocked the number immediately, but it left me rattled for days. How did she get my number? Was she still talking to my parents? Were they feeding her information about me? Paranoia started creeping in again. I found myself checking over my shoulder in public places, scanning crowds for familiar faces. I even started avoiding certain areas of town altogether. Every time I saw someone who might have been connected to Emily or my parents, my heart would start racing. Meanwhile, the lawsuit moved forward. The day of the court hearing finally arrived, and I remember sitting in that cold, sterile room, staring at my parents across the aisle. My mom looked teary-eyed and fragile, like she'd been practicing her heartbroken mother face in the mirror for weeks. My dad, on the other hand, sat stiffly in his chair, arms crossed, jaw clenched. When they took the stand, they spun their story with precision. My mom talked about how much she loved me, how much it hurt her to be cut out of my life. My dad spoke about family loyalty and how he'd only ever wanted what was best for me. They painted themselves as saints who had been unfairly punished by their ungrateful son. But then it was my turn. My lawyer presented everything, every text, every email, every social media post Emily had made accusing me of faking DNA results. She went through the timeline of events, from the initial accusation to the restraining order, to the vandalism on my car. Piece by piece, she dismantled their version of events until there was nothing left but the cold, hard truth. The judge wasn't impressed with my parents' performance. The case was thrown out, and they were ordered to pay my legal fees. It should have felt like a victory, but as I walked out of that courtroom, all I felt was exhaustion. My parents didn't look at me as I passed them. My mom was crying. Real tears this time, I think. My dad wouldn't even lift his eyes off the floor. In the weeks following the hearing, things went quiet again. My parents stopped reaching out to people I knew. Emily disappeared from social media entirely. It felt like they'd finally realized they'd hit a dead end. But quiet doesn't always mean peace. I knew better than to let my guard down this time. Sure enough, a few weeks later, I got another letter in the mail. This one wasn't from a lawyer. It was from my dad. It was short. "We're sorry. We want to fix this. Please come home." No acknowledgement of the damage they'd done. No real apology. Just another attempt to sweep everything under the rug and pretend like the last year never happened. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The thing about trust is that once it's broken, it's nearly impossible to repair. My parents had proven, time and time again, that they were willing to throw me under the bus to protect their own egos. And Emily, well, I didn't even know where to start with her. So I made a choice. I chose myself. I chose my sanity, my peace, and my future. I cut the final threads tying me to them and focused on moving forward. But even now, some nights, I lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how things could have been different. Could I have handled things better? Was there something I missed? Some moment where I could have stopped this train wreck before it went off the rails? Deep down, I know the answer. It wouldn't have mattered. Some people are so wrapped up in their own stories that they'll never see the truth, no matter how many times you show it to them. After the lawsuit ended and my dad's half-hearted apology letter arrived, I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd finally back off. I didn't expect reconciliation. I didn't expect a genuine apology, but I hoped they'd just stop. Stop calling. Stop messaging people I knew. Stop trying to twist reality into something that fit their version of events. But if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that people who refuse to admit they're wrong don't just stop. They double down. The next chapter of this mess started with a family reunion. Or rather, the idea of one. I hadn't been to one of these gatherings in years, but apparently, my parents had decided to throw one and invite every cousin, aunt, uncle, and distant relative they could track down. I only found out about it because my cousin Erica texted me. "Hey, are you coming to the reunion? Your parents said you'd be there, and they're hoping it'll be a fresh start." I felt a chill run through me. I hadn't spoken to my parents since the lawsuit ended, and now they were telling people I was going to show up to some grand family reconciliation? It wasn't hard to see the setup. They wanted me there, surrounded by people who'd been fed their sob story, cornered into some public spectacle where I'd either have to forgive them on their terms or look like the villain again. I texted Erica back, short and to the point. I wasn't invited, and I'm not going. She seemed surprised, which told me everything I needed to know. My parents were still lying to everyone, still trying to control the narrative. I sat on my couch that night, staring at the wall, feeling this mix of anger and exhaustion. It wasn't just the manipulation. It was how relentless it all was. They had an unlimited supply of guilt trips, twisted stories, and emotional blackmail, and they were determined to use every last drop of it. A few days later, I decided to send one final email to my parents. I kept it short and direct. I told them I knew about the reunion, that I wasn't coming, and that if they wanted any chance at a relationship with me in the future, they'd have to start by respecting my boundaries and being honest, not just with me, but with everyone they'd been lying to. I hit send, closed my laptop, and tried to move on with my day. My dad called me the next morning. I didn't answer, but he left a voicemail. His voice was tight with controlled anger, the kind of tone he used when he was trying to sound reasonable but was actually seething underneath. "Adam, this reunion is supposed to be about healing. Your mother's heart is breaking over this. Don't let your pride ruin our family." Pride. That was the word he used. As if this entire situation was about my pride and not their repeated betrayals and lies. I deleted the voicemail without listening to the rest. The reunion came and went. I saw a few photos on Facebook. Smiling faces, tables filled with food. My parents front and center like the king and queen of some picture-perfect family kingdom. But I also noticed something else. The crowd was smaller than I'd expected. A few cousins I knew were missing. Some aunts and uncles I'd always been close with weren't there. Turns out, not everyone had bought into my parents' version of the story. Erica filled me in later. Apparently, at the reunion, people started asking questions. Why wasn't I there if it was supposed to be about reconciliation? Why had no one reached out to me directly? My parents fumbled through their excuses, but cracks started showing in their carefully crafted narrative. A few weeks later, I started getting messages from family members I hadn't spoken to in months. Some of them were just checking in, asking how I was doing. Others were apologizing. I should have asked you your side of the story earlier. I didn't realize how bad things had gotten. Your parents weren't honest with us, and I'm sorry for believing them. It felt strange. I appreciated the messages, but it didn't change the damage that had already been done. Some people only believed the truth when it became inconvenient to ignore it. But while a few relatives were coming around, my parents doubled down again. This time, their tactics took an even darker turn. One night, I came home from work to find an anonymous note slipped under my apartment door. It wasn't handwritten. It was typed, printed on plain white paper. You think you can just walk away from your family? You'll regret this. I felt this sick, twisting feeling in my stomach. Was it from my parents? Emily? Someone else entirely? I had no way of knowing, but it didn't matter. The message was clear. They weren't done with me yet. I installed another security camera that night, this time aimed directly at my front door. I considered going to the police again, but without proof of who had left the note, there wasn't much they could do. Over the next couple of weeks, things got quieter again. My parents stopped trying to reach out. Emily seemed to have gone radio silent, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe that maybe, finally, it was over. But then, out of nowhere, my ex-girlfriend Rebecca reached out to me again. Hey, I'm sorry to bother you, but your mom messaged me. My stomach dropped. Rebecca and I hadn't been together in years, and we hadn't exactly ended on great terms. But now my mom was reaching out to her? Rebecca forwarded me the messages. My mom had painted this tragic picture of herself, the heartbroken mother whose son had cruelly cut her out of his life. She said things like, I just want to understand why Adam hates us so much. Please, if you ever loved him, talk to him for us. It wasn't just desperate. It was manipulative on a level that left me speechless. My mom was reaching into the past, digging through my relationships, trying to find any crack she could exploit to get to me. I sent Rebecca a quick thank you message and blocked my mom on yet another account. At this point, I realized something. They were never going to stop. They were never going to back off, apologize, or respect the boundaries I'd put up. They were going to keep clawing at the edges of my life, trying to wedge themselves back in through guilt, lies, or brute force. So I made a decision. I cut off the last remaining threads tying me to them. I changed my phone number. I closed old social media accounts and made new ones with tighter privacy settings. I stopped sharing details of my life with anyone who still had ties to my parents. It felt extreme, but it also felt necessary. Some people might say, but they're your parents, you can't just cut them out forever. But the truth is, some relationships are so toxic, so corrosive, that the only way to save yourself is to walk away entirely. I don't know if they'll ever stop trying to get back into my life. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. But for now, I've done everything I can to protect myself. And honestly, for the first time in what feels like forever, I can finally breathe again. After cutting those last remaining ties, changing my number, locking down my social media, and shutting every possible door they could use to get to me, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. Silence. Not the tense, suffocating kind of silence that feels like the calm before a storm, but real silence. Peaceful, still, and heavy with relief. For a while, I tried to settle into this new phase of my life. Therapy helped a lot. My therapist kept reminding me that setting boundaries, even with family, isn't cruel, it's necessary. But no matter how much progress I made, there were still moments where guilt crept in, wrapping itself around my chest like a vice. It wasn't guilt because I thought I'd done something wrong. It was guilt because walking away felt like failure, like I'd lost. I kept replaying everything in my head, analyzing every decision, every word spoken, every text sent. Could I have done something differently? Was there some moment where I could have stopped this snowball from becoming an avalanche? But every time I went down that rabbit hole, I hit the same wall. My parents and Emily had made their choices. They'd chosen to believe a lie, chosen to double down on it even when the truth was staring them in the face. That wasn't on me. Months passed, and life started to feel normal again. I built a routine, reconnected with friends who had stood by me, and started focusing on my career. Slowly, the weight on my chest started to lift. But just when I started to believe that chapter of my life was truly over, the universe, or maybe just my parents, decided to remind me that ghosts don't stay buried for long. It started with a random encounter at a grocery store. I was grabbing some stuff for dinner when I heard someone say my name. I turned around, and there she was, Emily. She was standing at the end of the aisle, holding a basket and staring at me like she'd seen a ghost. For a split second, we just stood there, frozen. Then she started walking toward me. My stomach knotted up, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to walk away, but my feet stayed glued to the floor. When she got close enough, she stopped and just stared at me. "Hi, Adam," she said quietly. I didn't respond. I couldn't. She sighed and looked down at her feet, then back up at me. I messed up. That caught me off guard. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, she was about to apologize. But instead, she kept going. "I didn't mean for things to go this far. I was scared. I thought you'd help me, and when you didn't, I didn't know what else to do." It wasn't an apology. It was an excuse. "You lied, Emily," I said, my voice steady but sharp. "You lied, and you let everything fall apart because of it. You let my parents disown me. You let people turn against me. Do you even understand what you did?" She flinched but didn't say anything. There were tears in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were real or just another performance. "I can't do this," I said finally. "I'm done. Stay away from me." I turned and walked away without looking back. That interaction left me rattled for days. My therapist told me I handled it well, that I stayed calm. I stood my ground, and I walked away. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt hollow. Emily had said she messed up, but she didn't apologize. She didn't take responsibility. And that was the problem. None of them ever did. A few weeks later, my dad sent me an email. Another one. I'd blocked his number, but apparently, he'd found a way to slip past the cracks. The email was long, rambling, filled with thinly veiled guilt trips and vague mentions of regret and family bonds. But again, no apology. No acknowledgement of what they put me through. Just more manipulation, dressed up in nicer words this time. I didn't respond. It became clear to me that they weren't capable of change. My parents weren't sorry for what they'd done. They were sorry for the consequences. They were sorry they'd lost control over me. Sorry they couldn't pull me back into their orbit. So I decided to stop waiting. Waiting for an apology, waiting for closure, waiting for something that was never going to come. I had to let it go. Not for them, but for me. Letting go isn't easy. People like to throw that phrase around like it's as simple as flipping a switch, but it's not. It's a daily choice. Every time I catch myself wondering if my parents miss me, if they regret what happened, if Emily ever truly realized the damage she caused, I have to remind myself that those questions don't matter. They're not mine to answer. Over time, the weight of it all started to fade. The anger softened, the sadness dulled, and the guilt started to loosen its grip. I stopped avoiding places around town. I stopped scanning crowds for familiar faces. I stopped letting their shadows follow me everywhere I went. But some scars stay with you, no matter how much time passes. Holidays are hard. Birthdays feel empty. There are moments when I see a happy family at a restaurant or a father and son laughing together, and it hits me, what I've lost, what was taken from me, and what might never come back. But here's the thing. I'm okay. I'm building a life I'm proud of. I have friends who feel more like family than my real family ever did. I have peace. And more importantly, I have the knowledge that I did the right thing. Walking away wasn't easy. Cutting them off wasn't easy. But it was necessary. Because sometimes, love isn't enough to fix what's broken. Sometimes, the only way to heal is to walk away and never look back. I don't know if my parents will ever change. I don't know if Emily will ever truly understand the damage she caused. But I do know this. I'm done carrying the weight of their mistakes.